In previous videos, we've made a number of queries, and now we're finally going to put them all together. In our current application, we are populating an autocomplete text view by fetching data from a JSON stream and then putting that into an array adapter, and that array adapter feeds our autocomplete text. The only trick is we potentially could get about 3,000 plants this way, and we don't want to make this fetch every single time the user comes to this screen. Instead, we want to cache the data locally. And so what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at our doInBackground method and our async task. And we're going to say, hey, do we have enough information locally to handle this, or do we need to fetch information from an online data source and then save it locally? So what we'll do is start with our offline plant DAO and extract an interface. Generally, we like making variable types interfaces so that we can switch out the implementation at a later time if needed. So I'm going to right click and choose refactor, and then choose extract, and then finally interface. And the interface, I'm going to say, I'm going to pick only things that are specific to a database implementation. I'm going to name the interface offline plant DAO. And what do we want to put there? Well, let's see. We want the constants can stay down here, but the insert method, the count plants, and the fetch all GUIDs method, those we want to pull up to the new interface. I'm also going to say implements plant DAO. We'll go ahead and move that up to the new interface as well. Everything looks good. I'm going to choose refactor. If you saw one of my previous videos, we did a If you saw one of my previous videos, we did a, let me pull that up actually. Might be a little tricky to see here, but we did a class diagram where we have offline plant DAO, implements offline plant DAO, that extends plant DAO. These two are interfaces. These three are subclasses, or classes rather, and then this is the superclass of offline plant DAO. So we've just popped this guy out. We've just created this guy right here. A lot of people think interfaces are a lot of extra work, but as you see, I was able to refactor, do that very quickly. So now I'm going to go back to my activity, my GPS to plant screen, and I'm going to make a new variable for offline plant DAO in this doInBackground method. I'm going to say offline plant DAO, that's the interface I just created, offline plant DAO equals new offline plant DAO, and that's the class where we have all of our queries. So notice by having a separate interface, I'm keeping my database specific queries out of the other two classes, the online DAO, which doesn't have database access. So Alt-Enter, import, fix our imports here, and Alt-Enter again, fix our import. Okay, looks good. Now, one little trick with this is that we get a red line because I'm trying to call a default constructor, but guess what? If we take a look at this class, we don't have a default constructor. Again, if you remember from several videos ago, we had to make a special constructor that would take a context because it has to pass that context, a database name, a cursor factory, and a database version number up to the superclass SQLite Open Helper. The DAO doesn't know what its context is, so we have to pass that in from our GPS plant. Normally, in an activity, that would just be the keyword this, but it's a little trickier here because we're in an inner class and we actually have to pass in the enclosing class, which is all the way up here, this thing called GPS plant. There's a little hack we can do to get that to work. We simply say GPS plant dot this, and that will satisfy our context argument. I know that's a little bit confusing. Don't worry about it. Just, that's what we have to do to make this constructor work. Okay, now what we're going to do is say, well, how many do we have? So I'm going to say offline plant DAO dot count plants. Remember that method? We just made it in our last video. Okay, Control Alt V to extract a local variable, and we'll call this variable count plants. And now we're going to say, okay, if count plants is less than 1,000, I just kind of picked that number out of the air, Then we want to fetch the stuff online. And so I'm going to do an open curly, and my scope's going to be a bit messy here, and a closed curly, and you see it automatically formats for me. My scope is a bit messy here because I have a bunch of returns and I'm going to need to clean those up. I'm going to take this return. I'm just going to bump it out after that if test. Just a moment. A little more refactoring. It's not really good practice to have multiple returns. So what I'm actually going to do is a little more housekeeping here. I'm going to declare this new array list up above and say list all plants equals new array list. I need to put a generic identifier in there, plant DTO. There we go. And then I'm going to say all plants equals plant DTO fetch plants, and then return all plants. So a little housekeeping there, but now you see I have only one return statement, which makes this a whole lot cleaner. Okay, now what if I have more than 1,000 plants? No worries. In that case, we'll just fetch the information from the local database. This is just saying, okay, we're going to get these plants from our online data source and we're going to save them locally. If we know there are about 3,000 plants. Let's say the number 1,000 is kind of random. But we know if we have less than 1,000, we don't have all the plants, so let's go get them. So in the try block here, we're getting all of our plants. And now what we're going to do is we're going to run through a loop. So I'll place a comment here that says iterate over all of the plants we fetched and place them into the local database. Oops, sorry. Database. There we go. Also, I'll put a comment here that just indicates what I mentioned earlier. If we have less than 1,000 plants, we don't have them all. Let's get them. Okay, in Android Studio, ITER Control J will give us a for each loop. And you see here, it's smart enough to know that we want to iterate over all plants. That's the local collection or iterable closest to this for each loop. Each time we iterate, it's going to assign that plant to this all plants variable. Okay, all looks good to me. Yep, all looks good to me. So, okay, now what I want to do is I want to do the insert into the database. But you know what I forgot? I need to run it through that mask to say, do you already exist in the database? So let me do that up above before this for each loop, and I can use my existing offline plant DAO. I created this query in an earlier video. Fetch all GUIDs. That gives us all of the global unique identifiers for all of the plants that are in our local database. Okay, so Control-Alt-V assigned to a local variable, and we're going to call this, we'll make up our own names. We'll say local GUIDs, or whatever you want to call it. That works for me. Okay, now in the for each loop, we're going to say, okay, if, and then I want to take a look at the local plant we're iterating over, and to be honest with you, I don't like this all plant name here. I'm going to change that to just plant. That'll work. Oh, no, not plant DTO, just plant. That'll work. If plant dot get GUID, that's the global unique identifier that we got from our online data source, plant places, okay, is greater than 0. We might want to reserve negative numbers for a special indicator. And double ampersand, all GUIDs dot contains, local GUIDs dot contains integer dot value of plant dot get GUID. What in the world is that? And I will warn you, I'm not finished. There's still more to go. Okay. What I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, let's make sure we have a legitimate, valid GUID. Afterwards, let's ask, do we have that GUID in this collection of all of our local GUIDs? If we do, we don't need to insert it again. Remember, local GUIDs, that's a representation of all of the global unique identifiers in our local database. So if this returns true, we don't need to add this plant to our local database because we already have it. If it returns false, we do want to add the plant to our local database. Now the trick is an AND operation that we see here will only result to true if both the left comparison and the right comparison result to true. So we actually have to negate this with the exclamation. Okay, so what we're saying is if we have a legitimate GUID and that GUID is not already in our local database, then we want to insert it into our database. Let me rearrange these comments a bit because I know that sounds complicated. We could run a query to do this, but this is a very efficient way to do it, especially because we're using this thing called a set data type. And a set is really efficient if you just want to ask it a question. A set is a collection. And if you just want to ask the question, does your collection contain this value, then a set is a very good choice to make there. Okay, do we have a valid GUID, and is it not in our local database? If so, then insert. Okay, insert into database. So here we're going to say offline plant DAO dot insert. Remember we made this insert method a while ago, and then we simply pass in our plant. Okay, and at this point, we're in pretty good shape. So a few more things we're going to want to do here, but we're at least at a point where we can test this out. So I'm going to go ahead and run this in the emulator, and we'll see how it works. Now our emulator is up, and let's take a look and see what we have. I'm going to choose F8 to step over each of these lines. F8, F8. And okay, we're creating our plant DAO. F8, F8, looks good. F8, F8. Now we want to step into this query here. And so I'm going to choose run, and we remember step into is F7. Step into means I want to walk into this method and watch what's going to happen. So I choose F7, I choose F8, F8. Now here's something interesting, cursor.getReadableDatabase.raw query. I mentioned the first time that we try to access the database, it's going to run the Oncreate method. And I'll admit I'm a little bit nervous here because I've made a lot of videos and I haven't tested them because we're now at the point where we can test them. What I'm expecting to see is when I choose F8 here, our Oncreate method will fire because it's going to realize that I do not have a local database. So I choose F8 and let's see what happens. Sure enough, the Oncreate method fires, but remember this is only going to fire one time, and that is the first time it realizes it does not have the database. There's a lot of syntax in here. I have to make absolutely sure my spaces and my punctuation is correct. And I choose F8. If there's a problem making the database, it's going to happen here. And I choose F8 again, fingers crossed. So far it looks good. Or maybe not. Okay. I'm going to choose a step out. Step out is Shift F8. Okay, Shift and F8. Shift and F8. Okay, F8. 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 How many plants do we have? We should have none because we just started the database. We just created it. Let's make sure that that looks reasonable. It says 0, which is exactly what I expected. Next time around, I'm going to expect to see, well, hopefully, if we're able to insert some plants, I'm going to expect to see some records. So we return plant count, F8 again. That's going to take us back to our thread. Now, an interesting side note, this is a thread. So if we look at the emulator, our screen has come up and it is even reacting. I could click pause GPS or show saved or take photo. Because I'm in a separate thread, we can continue to use our user interface. Okay, so F8, count plants is definitely less than 1,000, so I F8 again. Okay, now all plants, plant DAO fetch plants. This is where we're going to do a network call. We did this in several videos ago, so we should feel pretty safe that this one's going to work. It's passing in, as I recall, it's going to pass in the word redbud, which is going to give us about 13 results. And that came up in my other monitor, but yeah, there you go, it's redbud. Okay, so we choose F8. This one will take a moment because it has to do a network call. The next thing that's going to run is the local GUIDs query that's going to tell us all of the unique identifiers of our current database. There should be none because, again, we just created this database. So F7, step into, select GUID from plants, and again, just checking my punctuation before I run this, and that all looks good. F8, F8, run the query. We should have no results from this, honestly. It wouldn't surprise me if we completely skip this if test, because, yep, sure enough we do. We close, we return all GUIDs, and I realize I might have, maybe I'll be okay. I might get a null pointer up here. Okay, now we're going to iterate over all of the plants we got from our JSON stream, and this is where I'm worried about a null pointer. But if they don't exist in the database, which they do not, we're going to insert them into the database. So F8, okay, looking good so far. F7, so we can step in and take a look at this query we're putting together. Content values, GUID, genus, species, cultivar, and common. Okay. And let's take a look before we insert this. I'm going to bet this is plant number 83, Cercis canadensis, a eastern redbud. And Cercis canadensis, I see that. Looks like it doesn't have all the information just yet. Cercis canadensis GUID 83. GUID, that means that's our plantplaces.com ID. Just a moment, I'll bring that up. Okay, so the JSON string that we've run is plantplaces.com. Perl Mobile combined named redbud, and this is the data that we fetch from Plant Places. We're currently on the very first plant, plant number 83 in Eastern Redbud. If I go to plantplaces.com and I search on any plant, I could search on a pawpaw or any other plant, doesn't really matter. Okay, a Semina triloba. Note that the number that follows plant ID here is the unique ID. All I need to do is change that to an 83, and it's going to pull up information on our Eastern redbud. Okay, so that's the global unique identifier. Okay, now we're going to write this into the database. Once again, I'm going to get just a little bit nervous here because I have not tested this before doing this video. I choose F8, fingers crossed, no exception. We look good. Now take a look. Remember this little trick we did where we get back the local identifier, not the global identifier, but the local identifier that's unique only within this Android device. That's going to start with 1, and it's set to auto increment. If you remember this create table statement, we have our auto increment. It's going to auto increment, so each time we insert a plant, it will add 1 to that number to keep it unique. So we look pretty good. And I'm going to F8, and we will iterate over this loop again. The next plant that we will see will probably be our 1020, the Cercis canadensis Appalachian Red redbud. And it's going to continue, and it's going to go through each of these plants. Okay, so we F8, and I'm going to keep going. I'm satisfied with the results so far, and because I've now walked through everything, I don't expect any further errors. So or any errors. I didn't get any errors yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say run, and then I'm going to say, well, let's see. I think it's waiting on me here. I'm going to say run and then resume program, which just says, okay, thank you very much. I'm all done. I don't need to step through this anymore. At this point, I anticipate that it has gone through and inserted all 13 of those records in my database. How can we know for sure? Well, what we can do is we can go to Android Device Monitor, and it does a little trickiness to come over here, but what we can do is we can physically look at that database file. As a matter of fact, if you have any issues with your Oncreate statement or with some kind of query and you need to run it again, you can go to this, what we call the DDMS, and you can physically delete the database file. I'll show you where to do that. This is the Android device monitor, which we previously called the DDMS. And I click on AVD19 and I click on File Explorer. Okay. Now I go to Data and I go to Data again. This is tricky if you don't know about it, but if you do, well, here it is, and it's really handy to use. Okay, now I need to look for my package, and my package is specified in my Android manifest. We can usually take a pretty educated guess at it. com.plantplaces.plantplaces14fs. It's either that or it's com.plantplaces. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No. That was a different one. It's this one right here. NW15S305, plantplaces.com, plantplaces15S305. I expand that and now take a look under databases. You see this thing, plantplaces.db? That's our database file. If you see it there, your Oncreate statement has run. If you need to force Oncreate to run again, simply go in here, take these two files, and click the little minus, which will delete them. The next time you run a query, the SQLite Open Helper will say, hey, I don't have a database with that name, and it will run that Oncreate statement. Now, by the way, where did this plantplaces.db name come from? Well, let's take a look. Remember our offline plant DAO. Remember that constructor? It was the second parameter. Can you have multiple databases for one application? The answer is certainly you can. You can't query across them, but you do have that opportunity to provide multiple databases, multiple database files if you want. I have done that before. Whoops. I wanted to save some data locally without changing my existing table structure, so I've done that before to save some other data locally. But in any case, that's where to look. In our next video, we're going to look at something called SQLite Open Helper, where we can actually pull this off and run queries against it, and that will kind of help us think about how we want to assemble some queries. So I'll see you in that video. Thank you.